LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
What is the secret of Soylent Green?
New York City in the year 2022. Nothing runs anymore. Nothing works. But the people are the same. And the people will do anything to get what they need.
This is the police.
What they need most is Soylent Green.
The supply of Soylent Green has been exhausted.
What is the secret of Soylent Green?
You will find out why Soylent Green means life. You will find out why Soylent Green means death.
We gotta stop them.
What is the secret of Soylent Green?
Please.
Nature, wounded, diseased, and enraged, took revenge on her murderers. She cut off their food supply and then waited while they consumed each other. A family runs for its life from a deadly virus that threatens to swallow up the earth.
Martial law.
But there's no room to run.
Following the outbreak of
There's no place to hide.
there is some danger that
No blade of grass. No room to run. No place to hide. No blade of grass.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is John Michael Greer, who joins us to discuss his latest book, Dark Age America, Climate Change, Cultural Collapse and the Hard Future Ahead. As we lurch on into the early part of the 21st century, converging crises in energy, economy and environment are rapidly undermining the foundations of industrial civilization and the materialistic way of life which so many of us take for granted. Energy, because cheap, easily accessible fossil fuels are running out, and industrial civilization as we know it simply cannot be sustained by renewables. Economy, because at almost every level, global, national, corporate and personal, we are drowning in debt that cannot and therefore will not be repaid, but whose unravelling will cause mass destruction of governments, banks, entire industries and millions of lives. Environment, because centuries of industrial civilization have wreaked havoc on the biosphere, triggering catastrophic climate change while poisoning the ecosystems on which life on Earth depends. Factor in population growth, mass migration and escalating terrorist threats, and you have a dangerously unstable situation. Despite the protestations of puppet politicians, elite economists and utopian scientists, no amount of wishful thinking, money printing or shiny new technology will ride to the rescue. The Prius of our dreams is heading straight for the brick wall of reality, and the current convulsions such as the Brexit referendum in the UK, the impending implosion of the European Union and the election of Donald Trump as US President are but the latest wave of woes crashing on the shore of a fantasy future we fashioned for ourselves in a brief moment of gas-guzzling madness. Under the illusion of invincibility, we still tell ourselves that this time it's different, but as we shall soon discover, forces far beyond our control have other ideas. In his most uncompromising work to date, John Michael Greer maps possible futures for America during the hard times ahead, and it's clear that before things get better, they're going to get a lot worse. Hello and welcome, John, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on again.
This is believe it or not, John, this is the 7th time.
Have there been that many? Time flies when you're having fun, I guess.
They do stack up. We started back in 2012. I think it might have been with the long descent. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was actually. So it's been a lot has happened in that time, and of course, a lot of things haven't happened as well. So that's a story in itself, which we'll get to. Now, today we're going to be discussing your brand new book. It is entitled Dark Age America, Climate Change, Cultural Collapse, and a Hard Future Ahead. If the title itself doesn't spell out exactly the sort of territory we're going to be roaming around, tell listeners just a little bit about yourself, your work in general, and then set out first the basic premise of the book.
Okay. What should I say about myself? I am a historian. I am a writer. I've done a lot of research into the rise and fall of civilizations, and one of the things that I had to come to terms with early and often is a huge gap between the way most of us think about history in this culture here and now and the way that history actually works. We have this thing, and of course we've talked about this in a previous show, we have this faith in progress. We have this notion that the future should always be better than the past. History is this one-way trip from the caves to the stars. But that's not what history shows. What history shows is that civilizations have a life cycle. They're born, they grow up, they mature, they age, they fall, they die. It's a basic assumption of our sort of civil faith in progress that doesn't apply to us, that can't apply to us. No, we're on our way to the stars, all the usual tropes. In fact, the point of the book, the basic premise of the book, is that the normal cycle of civilizations does apply to us. I would say that there's plenty of evidence in existence right now that we're already well on our way, tipping over the edge on that process of decline and fall. And so this is where things get interesting, because civilizations, of course, are very different. Every civilization develops its own ways of looking at the world, its own sciences, its own arts, its own cultural creations. There's a lot of diversity in civilizations. But when they end, they start becoming more and more similar. And Dark Age societies around the world, I'll get to the meaning of that term in a bit. Dark Age societies around the world are astonishingly similar. You have the kind of society that takes shape in the aftermath of a civilization. It doesn't matter what the civilization is. You're going to have certain basic features in common. So, my project, which originally I explored in my blog, The Arch Druid Report, and then, of course, in this book, was to say, okay, if we take the standard process of decline and fall and the standard post-civilizational society, standard Dark Age society, and then put that onto the map of North America in the wake of our civilization, and then factor in things like climate change and the other things, the little gifts that we're leaving behind to our descendants, what does the next 500 years look like? It's actually very plausible to sketch that out. You can come up with a very clear idea of exactly what we're facing. Now, of course, as the title and subtitle as you read suggests, this is not necessarily cheerful news. Certainly not compared to the Star Trek fantasies and the like. But it's nice, if the future is our destination, is the place where we'll be spending the rest of our lives, it's a good idea to know what it looks like. And this book is my attempt to sketch out the next 500 years of North American history in advance.
I had an interesting conversation with a younger guy recently, basically a generation down from me, and it was revolving around I had read a newspaper story about the return of supersonic flight, which after the demise of Concorde was pretty much old news, history in the bin, compost heap. And it mentioned in this article the supersonic airliner that Boeing failed to get off the ground or put into commercial production in the 70s. And this young guy was saying, oh, well, yeah, but that production work gave us the 747, which was a wildly successful airliner. It's true. And he was basically just denouncing me as a naysayer and said that, oh, well, there's always been those people. We have trains, planes and automobiles now. And at one time, it wasn't at all clear that those were going to work, and people were saying they couldn't work. I'm sure we all remember in the early days of cars, that they had one guy walking in front of them with a warning flag, which seems absurd now. And his whole argument really, not just regarding supersonic flight, but technological progress in general, was, it was another version of it's different this time.
Except that's an example of massive cherry picking. Of all this, you basically take the handful of technological projects that did turn out to work and say, well, look at those examples. Let's try this one. Well, they said perpetual motion wouldn't work. Guess what? They were right. What about dirigibles? Where are our fleets of dirigibles that we were supposed to have cruising through the skies? Did that work? How about cities under the ocean? When I was a kid, the idea was that by the year 2000 we were going to have cities under the ocean, blah, blah, blah. That didn't work either. We could go on. The fact of the matter is that you can believe that progress always happens, that any technology we can imagine we can have, only if you look at the successes and ignore the failures. There are many, many failures. And so this is one of the reasons that I treat belief in progress as a religion, because the people who believe in it will defend it with the kind of simplistic, cherry-picked, logically deficient arguments that you normally get from a street preacher. They don't look at it objectively. They don't say, okay, what hasn't worked? What are the things that what are the promises that technology has made that haven't come to pass? It's always, cars. Okay, yeah, some people said that cars were not going to be a functional technology. Arguably, in the long term, they're not, as the smoke coming out of their tailpipes is destabilizing the global climate. But we can set that aside for a while. Okay, we have cars, we have planes, we have trains. There were some naysayers. We don't have perpetual motion. We're not turning lead into gold at any particular pace. We don't have the dirigibles. We don't have supersonic transport. And the reason for that latter, by the way, and it's a crucial one, is it's not economical. We can maybe we can build anything we can imagine, although that's even questionable. Can we afford the result? In many cases, no. So this whole faith-based assumption that anything we can daydream we're guaranteed to have, it's very comforting. It's very reassuring. We can hold it to ourselves like a teddy bear in the face of an increasingly grim future. But it doesn't actually have much relation to the real world.
Well, if we could perhaps give this discussion a headline or a title, perhaps we could borrow the name of one of your previous books, Not the Future We Ordered, because that's really the situation we're looking at the minute. And evidence is piling up left, right and centre that industrial civilization is in trouble. But in response, in general, we seem to be doubling down on the behaviour that's brought us to this state of affairs in the first place. I talk a great deal about the 3 E's on a lot of the shows that I do, those being energy, economy and environment. And we know those are tremendously interconnected, but the degree of that interconnectedness is really being shown in stark relief at the moment as problems in one area spill over into another, etc., etc. So perhaps in discussing these areas, we should start with energy, because that is the basis for industrial civilization, without which it cannot exist. And that's really where the energy situation is, where the rubber meets the road at the moment. That's, in terms of problems, that seems to be where a lot of it is going down.
That's one of the 2 places it's going down. The other one is environment, and we'll get to that in due time. The energy situation, this is just at the moment, due to demand destruction and a lot of economic manipulation on the part of the Soviet Union, part of the Russia and a few other places. The price of oil has dropped down, as it did after the 2 previous spikes that we had in 2008, 2009, and in 2015. Price of oil is down. So everyone's saying, oh, we have all the oil we could possibly want. It doesn't matter. It's going to spike again. My guess is that it's going to be, let's say 2021 when it peaks. What we have going on at this point, in terms of petroleum, is that when the price is high enough to justify production of things like oil out of tar sands and so on, which is very expensive, it's too expensive for people to afford the product. When the price drops to the level that people can afford it, you can no longer afford to keep producing the tar sands. So we're having this whipsawing motion of prices, which is causing a lot of economic disruption. but the thing is, smooth that curve out over the long term, and what we've got is oil production. Well, let me step back here. Oil, quote unquote, petroleum, quote unquote. We have various liquid fuels being produced. They're being lumped together as petroleum. Some of them are, some of them aren't. The stuff that they're getting out of the fracked natural gas wells in Pennsylvania, north of me here. That's actually better for lighter fluid than it is for running cars. It's very thin. The stuff that you get from tar sands it sounds tar. You cut that with lighter fluid, and you turn it into something that you can break down into gasoline and diesel fuel and so on. Basically, all kinds of junk that wasn't being counted as petroleum, nobody was bothering with 10, 15, 20 years ago, is being thrown into the hopper at this point to maintain some kind of stability in petroleum production, while the big wells running conventional petroleum, all of the legacy fields we've got out there, their production is steadily depleting. So we're in a situation where we're throwing more and more of our economic activity, more and more of available energy and resources into desperately trying to maintain a supply of petroleum in some sense of that word. And we have to, because 40% of the world's energy and all its transportation come from petroleum. Coal is in a very similar situation. The stuff that is being mined now and used as coal is mostly stuff that 100 years ago was being thrown away because it was so low quality. It's riddled with sulfur. It's full of all kinds of impurities and ghastlinesses. It's very difficult. It doesn't burn well. It doesn't produce a lot of heat per ton. But it's what we have left. And so we have these increasingly frantic attempts at mountain removal mining and all this kind of stuff. The increasingly frantic attempts to scrape the bottom of the barrel. Natural gas, a little better situation. Best estimates I've seen are that even with the whole fracking business, if that ever manages to pay for itself, we're going to be at peak natural gas by 2030 or so. So basically, all of our fossil fuels are rapidly depleting. All of them are being used as fast as we can extract them, and of course, the Earth is finite. It only has so much fuel in it. So the sort of broad backdrop situation is that we're throwing more and more of our energy and resources into maintaining fossil fuel production, and attempts to replace that with nuclear power or with renewables have fallen flat. You hear a lot of preening over the German solar energy system. Nobody talks about, or very few people talk about, the fact that that only exists because it's propped up by huge government subsidies. Okay, analysis of Spain's big, also heavily subsidized solar energy system suggests, in Spain has a lot of sunlight. They're well to the south, and yet they're producing, in effect, a trickle of energy. They're only economical because they get the subsidies. Nuclear power, of course, is the biggest subsidy dumpster of all. No nation on Earth has ever been able to maintain a nuclear power industry without huge ongoing government subsidies to pay for the fact that nukes simply don't produce power at a cost that people can afford. So we've got this energy background right now, which is not something people are looking at right now because the price of oil is down. That's one of those little things. One of the problems with the short-sightedness of contemporary cultural and political life is precisely that. Okay, the prices will down. We're going to forget all about fossil fuel depletion. They'll be talking about it again. Give it 2, maybe 3 years when the prices start soaring again.
Well, one point about considering talking about or not talking about depletion in the context of the price is it doesn't matter what the price is now or ever will be, that will not change the amount.
No, it's a good point, but there's actually a flip side to that. Because if you can only get $10 a barrel, there's a lot of petroleum that basically doesn't exist economically speaking. Because at $10 a barrel, you can't afford to pump it. And if it's $100 a barrel, you can afford to pump more. So there's a way in which economics feeds back into not the physical amount, but the economically available amount. the problem, the difficulty is when you've got prices swinging back and forth wildly. You've got a lot of economic disruption. You've got industries and individuals who are unable to figure out, how much money am I going to have to pay for, to keep my house warm, or to run a fleet of trucks, or to ship this, or to fly that. And that kind of instability imposes massive costs of its own.
Okay, you're absolutely right. That's a point well made, and that is actually how the real world is operating. I guess I was going with a thought experiment which you could apply to oil. You could apply it to rare earth metals or lots of other important resources. And, I was just following through logically to some future situation where it's like literally we can't find any of this stuff. We really don't know where there is anymore. And someone just say, well, it's all right. I've got $1 billion here. Find some. They're saying, no, I don't think you understand.
Yeah. It's the U.S. government has been doing that with moderate Syrian rebels of late, for the last several years. Obama says, get me some moderate Syrian rebels, and the CIA goes off and tries to look for some, and they come back empty-handed. There are none. Okay. But it's the same kind of thing. Yeah, you're right. But one of the things that has blindsided a lot of people in the peak oil scene, and that has led to some very badly mistaken predictions that have ended up discrediting some peak oil writers, unfortunately, is that people take that approach. Okay, we're just going to use it until it runs out, and then we can't find it anymore. But the economic factors bite first and hardest. I mean, it's like there's for example, I forget how much it is, but there's a whole mess of gold dissolved in the oceans. And you could literally extract gold by the kilogram from seawater. If you could do it in an economic fashion, you can't. It's been tried. It's been tried and tried and tried, and at this point, it's become one of those things that people use as a scam. There's no way that you can extract gold from seawater at a price that makes it worth extracting the gold from seawater. It's going to cost you more than you'll get by selling the gold, even at current inflated prices. I've actually had people insist that there's plenty of nuclear fuel in the world. There's even more uranium in seawater than there is gold. Okay, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Another example of point: the ITER fusion reactor research program that is currently currently the most expensive scientific experiment in history. They've poured like $17 billion down this particular rat hole. It's not yet completed. There will be more. Everyone's going. The people who are cheerleading it certainly are going, oh wow! If we can make this happen, we can take another big step toward fusion power. We have this abundant fusion power. Look at all the hydrogens out there. Okay, fine. How are you going to, if it's taking you, say, $20 billion to build a reactor, how much is electricity going to cost when it comes out of that reactor? Nobody wants to talk about that. And yet that's the one thing that matters. Fusion power is not an option because nobody could afford to use the electricity. You cannot produce electricity at a price that anyone can afford. Therefore, it's a waste of time and money. We should be putting that money into something that will produce something that's economically possible. So that's that. I know we've strayed across from energy into economy, and one of the traps people, it's really important to keep an eye on the 3 E's, but it's important to remember that they all intersect. They all overlap. Each one affects the other. It doesn't, as you say, it doesn't matter how much money you have. If we're out of lithium, it doesn't matter if you think you can extract, get an infinite supply of lithium batteries. In the same way, your economics and your energy thing have to deal with the impact on the environment. So it all loops around, it all forms one whole system, and the feedback loops are the major thing here. The feedback loops are hammering us.
Oh, certainly when I studied economics, and you make reference to Economics 101 in the new book, those of us who sat through, and this was introductory economics for teenagers. This was your beginning down the wormhole of economics, and did we ever discuss the environment in any of that? No, it was all abstract stuff on overhead projector graphs, good X, good Y, demand, supply. It was all purely abstract stuff. did we ever talk about energy only in terms of a commodity. And there was never any question that there wouldn't be enough. It would just be a question, well, what's the price of the energy? What's the price of oil? They were very, very discrete so-called disciplines that were, never the twain shall meet, a bit like biology, chemistry, and physics can be these days when we're talking about science. But talking about where energy overlaps then with economy, thinking about net energy, which is a very key concept that is ill understood. If I remember reading somewhere, a good net energy ratio might have been at one time maybe 200 to 1. That you could put 1 unit of energy into extracting a fossil fuel and you could get 200 units of energy out for that. That's good going. That's really good quality stuff. The best. And that has obviously been dropping and dropping. And I've read things like 5 to 1, 4 to 1, 3 to 1 now. Where I'm going with this, and I have asked you about this before, but I'm putting the point again because not everyone listening to this will have listened to the previous interviews we did. Could you ever imagine a scenario where 1-for-1 energy, absolutely breaking even, pointless on one level, or even somehow less than 1-for-1 energy, and this might sound completely illogical, and it would be, but the extraction might somehow continue, maybe with a different form of energy being used for the extraction compared to the sort of fuel they might be getting out. That charade might continue in order to actually keep a certain type of fuel showing up for a little longer.
As long as you include the words "for a little longer," no question. You can in some case leverage a lot of low quality energy. Okay, energy quality. How much energy concentration do you have per gallon? Let's say, petroleum is incredibly energy dense. One of the things that one of the comparisons that I like to use here is that the energy in 1 gallon of gasoline, if you want to have that in automobile batteries, it takes 1 ton of automobile batteries to have that much energy. So, if let's say, at some point in the future, you have, say, some coal that's still worth mining. You're digging it out by hand. Okay, you have people going in there with picks and shovels. You have, let's say, a huge population, and you need coal, and it doesn't matter to you that you're literally expending more energy in terms of the population, in terms of muscular energy, to get a certain amount of, to get that than you get back in terms of coal. You can keep that up for a while. You can keep that up for a little while if the difference isn't too great. If it's 1-for-1, let's say, you're producing X amount of food, you're getting that much, you're getting an exact equivalent in coal, but you need the coal more than you need the food. Yes, I could see that for a while, but here's the thing. You cannot maintain the energy you're getting out. The total net energy of your society is the energy on which everything has to operate. That's your budget. Okay? And if you're no longer breaking even, or if you're just breaking even, how are you going to have the energy to maintain everything else out there? So this is what we're seeing this in the United States already. Where we have rural counties that are allowing their roads to go back to gravel because they can no longer afford to keep them paved. We have huge rural districts that are just literally falling apart. They look like the Soviet Union in its last days. It's really quite stunning, and that's because they've been thrown overboard. The United States no longer has the resources because we're throwing so much of our available wealth into maintaining petroleum flow, both by fracking on the one hand, and of course our constant interventions in the Middle East, which are there purely and have been there since the 1970s for the sake of maintaining petroleum flow, keeping the oil flowing to our ports. So you've got this situation already where what's happening is because the net energy is ratcheting down, because we no longer have the 200-to-1 energy ratio you got from light sweet crude from shallow wells. Ultimately, that's what's behind the increasing shortages of resources for everything else. And so, we can imagine for a little while oil being produced at, when it's actually not economical to do. We have huge government subsidies going into it or what have you, but that's self-terminating because everything else falls apart. Because if you're throwing all your available energy into bringing out energy, what's keeping the rest of society running.
So while we're in the economic sphere, then let's say a word about that which follows on from the energy glut that we enjoyed for a while, which is growth, just generally economic growth in everything, but it's normally talked about in terms of GDP, for example, of a country, goods and services being produced, etc., etc. That has been the mantra for a long time. It was possible on many fronts for a long time because of the available energy. Now, that's beginning to, well, it has for some time, but it's beginning to more and more noticeably run into brick walls and buffers and problems. And as you pointed out, if you don't have the figures being juiced and the stats being manipulated, actually you begin to see economies, including that of the US, actually in recession. But still, and as recently as today, yesterday, I hear politicians, I don't even know what their actual conversations were about or the points they were making, but I would just hear incidentally floating from the airwaves, improved growth, increased growth, prospects for growth, and get back to growth. That's all there seems to be. And I do wonder quite often because, again, if we think about this logically, what can grow forever? Well, certainly not the human economy on a finite planet. But the people that talk this stuff, to what extent do they actually sort of intellectually believe this? And to what extent do they sort of say to themselves, well, obviously it's nonsense, but what else are we supposed to do, you know? Because, I mean, to you and I, it just seems like, well, hang on a minute. Nothing else can grow forever. They're just, you know, the planet's not getting any bigger.
The conversations that I've had with people lead me to think that they actually do believe it. And there's a curious kind of psychological blindness that makes that possible. It's a notion that I'm starting to call the permanent present. Okay? People don't actually think about the future. Literally, you try to get people, okay, let's extrapolate this 10 years, 20 years, and people will give you a blank look. Because they literally, to them, the future is more of now. And for some reason, they're stuck there. Increasingly, I watch that with people. And try to tell them that growth is finite, that you know, we live on a finite planet, growth is going to be followed by contraction, okay. And you might as well sprout two spare heads. Literally, you're talking something that they do not get at all, because they're stuck in the permanent present. The past is this sort of vague thing that we escaped from due to progress, and here we are, and it's like the people. I was on a show a while back with Chris Martinson of Peak Prosperity, and he mentioned when he goes around and gives talks to college audiences about the limits to growth, about where we're heading. At some point in there, a bunch of them are going to pick up their iPhones and wave their iPhones as though that disproves what he's saying, as though the fact that we have these technological trinkets, you know, proves that progress is still on track and everything's going to be fine, blah, blah, blah. People don't think about the future anymore. Now, in fact, if you extrapolate current rates of growth in anything, you very quickly equal absurdity. I forget who it was that pointed out quite sensibly, this was back in the 70s, that, you know, current rates of human population growth at a certain point, in the not vastly distant future, the total weight of human beings will outweigh the planet Earth. Obviously, this is not going to happen. But, you know, people don't think about the future. They've closed their minds to the future, possibly because the future is frankly too scary. So, we've got people who are stuck in this belief in growth, belief in progress, belief in, you know, we can't go back, whatever that means. And I really do think most of them do believe it because they don't think. I mean, human beings don't actually do much thinking. It's hard for us. We don't like it. And we like to emote. We're good at emoting. And so when you combine strong emotions and thought-stopping phrases like growth, return to growth, it feels good, it warms our emotional condition, we go, okay, growth, and we stop thinking. And, you know, I don't know if we will ever get far beyond that. Certainly, looking back through recorded history, you don't get a lot of evidence that human beings are particularly smart. I don't know that Homo sapiens is a particularly accurate description of our species.
There was a point that you brought up in one of your recent blog posts, which I really liked, and you were talking about deep time in terms of our place in it, and you know we're all sorts of researchers and scientists and historians and anthropologists and everything have all sorts of interesting information about us, about the last 10,000 years, the last 100,000, the last million, the last billion. And it's all fascinating. The long road to how we came to be here, or certainly the theories about it. And you mentioned these little charts that you sometimes see. And I remember seeing one of these back, I think it probably would have been devised in the 70s, but I saw it in the 80s, and it had an environmental warning sort of slant about it. And I can't remember the information attached to it, but the little chart showed how recently, in terms of deep time, human beings have showed up on the Earth. And it was that usual, you see the long span of billions of years when nothing much was happening apart from a molten mass, and then this little tiny sliver right at the right-hand side, usually of the diagram, showing human beings. You're going, wow, you know, I mean, even we thought the dinosaurs were around for a relatively short time, but look at that. And the point you made recently was that this whole, whatever it is, 2 minutes to midnight, or, you know, however many seconds to midnight that we showed up, it stops at midnight. It stops at now. There's never anything in front of that thinking about, well, if we flip over, if we have a mirror image of the next however many billion years, what might that look like? And that's a key kind of block, I think, in our thinking.
Exactly. And I think it's one of the things that blinds people so powerfully to the future, that they're literally taught not to think about it. It's just the big run up to us. Full stop. What I did in my blog post was try to do the complete life cycle of life on Earth, seen from its beginning to its end, with us in there, in context. I'm really starting to think that getting the concept of the deep future across to people, the idea of deep time extending forward as well as back, and what does that imply? What can we know about the deep future? And we can actually know quite a bit. The sciences have given us a huge amount of information. History gives us a huge amount of information. There's a lot of stuff we can put in. My book, Dark Age America, in fact, can be thought of as a sort of first very small step. Okay, what can we know about the next 500 years? Quite a bit, actually. And so I tried to sketch that up. But down the road, I think I'm probably going to put some serious work into trying to sketch out the deep future. You know, what is time going to look like from here on? What might it? What are our possibilities? What do we know isn't going to happen? That's often easier to say. And so this is interesting stuff, because it's so untouched. There have been a few projects in this direction. There was this would be back, I think, in the 1980s. I could be wrong. A biologist named Dougal Dixon, I think, did a book called After Man, A Zoology of the Future, where he tried to imagine, okay, what's going to happen? Imagine human beings become extinct. What about 50 million years from now? What about 100 million years from now? It was fascinating stuff. And there have been a few other attempts in that direction, saying, okay, what's going to be around of our civilization in, say, 10 million years? But there's been very, very little of it. And I find that a fascinating prospect. And I think it's one that would really help people put their own lives and their own choices in a better context, much more useful than the permanent present.
Yes, perhaps it would bestow upon us a bit of humility. I don't know, maybe that's too optimistic from my perspective.
That might be a little much to ask for this species.
Okay, well, we've been talking then about economy. Let's throw in something here where it overlaps Venn diagram style with the environment. And there's something I did first hear about this in my Economics 101, but it wasn't expanded upon. It certainly wasn't given its full weight, and that's the concept of externalities. Now, I'm going to have you speak about this in a second, but essentially, when I first started to discover the real implications of this, these costs of doing business that companies of all sizes, but particularly large ones, that they rack up but they don't pay, that are then forced off onto governments or the environment in general, or the rest of us spread broadly, would make, if they were factored into the costs of doing business or manufacturing products or providing services, would make many of the big household company names that straddle the globe, Colossus-like, would make them absolutely non-functional. They couldn't make money. They'd be out of business if their bank were to demand that they actually make money. You know, the way that if you and I go overdrawn slightly, the bank are charging us and writing letters and sending heavies around to knock on the door, whereas the corporations can lose money, billions, seemingly for years, and yet the bank keep extending lines of credit. But I don't want to wander off on a rant there. If you could just address the issue of externalities and explain to people why it's so important, and increasingly so because of environmental costs.
To my mind, the entire issue of externalities is of central importance. As you were saying, an externality is a cost of business that the business doesn't pay. There are huge numbers of them. I remember seeing, along the lines of the thing you mentioned, a careful analysis that showed that the 20 largest industries in the world would all have to operate at a loss if they had to pay all the costs of their own business. So you have, environmental impacts. You have, various other costs that are pushed off onto other people. Okay. The fact that they're externalized doesn't make them go away. And the more externalities build up, somebody's going to be paying these costs. If the business is not paying the cost, people downstream who are drinking poisoned water from industrial waste are paying the cost in their health care. Or everyone pays the cost when the climate goes crazy, or, and so on and so forth. There's this long cascade. The cost is going to be paid by somebody. But because the companies can pretend it's not us, it's not our problem, they keep on making a paper profit, while society as a whole is suffering increasing economic burdens. At this point, externalities have become a massive economic force. You'll notice that around the world, national economies are stuck in what amounts to stagnation. The only things that are the only quote industries unquote that are really making money are the ones that are basically manipulating the money system. The banks, the real estate, the insurance companies, and so on. All the financial industries. That's where you can make big bucks now, because that's just game playing. That's just all they're doing is shuffling figures. They don't actually have to deal with the grotty world of goods, of actual goods and non-financial services. Everybody else is stuck in stagnation and increasingly in contraction. I mean, if you take the growth in the financial industry in the United States and subtract that from the growth that we've had, the real economy, the economy of actual goods and non-financial services, has been in contraction for years. It is declining. It is in, what's the euphemism now, negative growth. And why? I would argue that a very important part of that is the pressure of externalities. The fact that all of these costs are piling up in various places, and increasingly, they're piling up in the environment. The obvious place is global climate change. I just shortly before we started this conversation, I had a chance to check out a new report from one of the scientific programs in Antarctica. Another big ice sheet is cracking, and in this case, it's not cracking from the sea; it's cracking from the center, because seawater has flowed through underwater valleys and is literally lifting this entire ice shelf up from beneath and melting it. We're not that far removed from a point when southern Florida, southern Florida is very close to sea level. It gets all its water from shallow aquifers that are filled by rain. Seawater is flowing into those aquifers. We're not that far from the point when southern Florida is going to have to be evacuated because there is no fresh water to drink. Because all of the plants in the farms and everything else is dying from saltwater poisoning. We're not that far ultimately from the point when most of Florida is going to be salt marsh. We're not that far from the point when every really big storm along the northeast seaboard sends seawater cascading into the subway tunnels of New York City. These things are real costs. They've been pushed onto the environment, and now the environment is pushing them back. And the fact that the polluting industries don't have to pay for the cost, again, it makes it look profitable in the short term, for now. But, the industry is also dependent on society. It's dependent on a stable economy. It's dependent on a stable planet. And those are going away.
Okay, well then just to say a word about these environmental costs which are piling up. You've mentioned there sea level rise, which obviously affecting places like Florida in particular. And in the book, again, you go into some detail about North America, because that's, what you're concentrating on. But this effects obviously will be global to greater or lesser extent. you see more of these large storms, which, you know, certain parts of the US are used to up to a point, but then you see whether it's the storms increasing in frequency and severity, or whether it's wildfires, droughts, which quite often lead to wildfires, it piles up, and still it's kind of like somehow still suppressed a little bit in terms of that, though there's no pattern emerging here. But as with the energy situation and the economic situation we mentioned, it's getting increasingly hard to ignore. But the reaction, it's the same kind of constellation, to use a word that you like, which I've taken to using because I like it as well. It's the same constellation of responses, isn't it? Really, in terms of like denial and denouncement, and but also at the other end of the scale, hysteria, extreme hysteria about, as you often point out, it's got to be complete disaster for us, or the Jetsons' future. It can't be like any exactly. It can't be any messy
Star Trek or Mad Max. Take your pick.
Yeah, exactly. So but the environmental stuff is undeniable now, and of course you factor into not only the Earth systems here, but also in terms of pollution. Never mind nuclear, just in terms of other forms of pollution. Heavy metals and all sorts. Dioxins, and I mean, it's again, it's stuff that's piling up as externalities, and it's getting to the point where it can't really be ignored anymore.
And yet, it's precisely because it's not happening suddenly. It's the old thing about how do you boil a frog? You raise the temperature very slowly. By the time the frog realizes that the water is actually hot, it's half cooked and can't jump anymore. This is another of the problems with the what I've called the permanent present. People are not thinking, okay, how long has this been going on? What was going on back 10 years from now, or 10 years ago? Where is this going to end up 10 years from now? Because, and I honestly think, especially here in this country, that people are doing it deliberately. People are fleeing from the future. I've commented on my blog. It used to be that the only bars that had a TV were sports bars, and they had a big TV up front, and when there were sports games, when the football game or something, they'd turn that on, and everyone watched the football game, then they'd turn it off and cheer and get drunk. Nowadays, not merely bars, but restaurants, you go in and there are TVs all over the place. You can go into this place where there's screens side by side on every wall. Why? Why on earth would you want that, in a place where you're going for a meal or a drink? And the answer is very simple. People are desperately trying to drown out their awareness of just how bad things are. I've been pointing out, with reference to the recent political convulsions here in the United States, that in the United States, when I was a child back in the 1960s, a family with one ordinary working class income could afford a house, could afford a car, could afford 3 good meals a day for everybody in the family, and have a little left over besides the necessities for a luxury here or there, a few extra toys beneath the Christmas tree, maybe even a vacation. Okay? Nowadays, in the United States, if you have one working class income for a family, you're living on the street. That's an immense change. It's unfolded over half a century. But it's huge, and nobody's talking about it. Everybody's pretending as though it didn't happen and it doesn't matter, and forget about it. I mean, we're talking about half the American people who've been plunged into poverty and misery over half a century. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody wants to look at it or think about it. Now the bottom end of the middle class is being fed through the same thing. We have, all the people who are strutting around, making big money in the computer industry are all of a sudden finding their jobs offshored, and they're losing their benefits, their pay's being cut. It's not looking pretty, and they're starting to scream. But again, everyone's just turning their back. I really think here in the United States, especially, I can't necessarily speak for what's going on over on your side of the pond. A lot of people have fled to the permanent present because they're terrified of the future, and for good reason. But sticking your head in a hole in the sand is not a good survival trait. If your head is in the sand, your backside is a target. And increasingly, I think, a lot of the sort of political convulsions and the bizarre way that our politics and our society have gone show that they're terrified but they're not they're more terrified of thinking about the future than they are facing it. And so they're stumbling blindly ahead toward a future that's going to be worse than it has to be.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Be sure to tune in soon for part 2. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalisefreedom.com. That's legalise-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalisefreedom.com.